has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism.
Listeners, welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Calum Drysdale.
I'm Tom O, and our guest today is Ben Judah. Ben, welcome to the space station.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Ben is a foreign correspondent, turned think tanker, turned eloquent chronicler of Britain and Europe's forgotten underbellies. Most recently, he was a special advisor to David Lammy during Lammy's time as Foreign Secretary.
This means that Ben worked on the Chagos deal, which is, of course, of great interest to the Anglo-futurists. And today we've brought him up to the space station to ask him about the deal, its prospects, his grander vision for the rest of the overseas territories, and some ritualistic howling.
Ben, I'd like to start with a quote from your piece in The Times recently. You said of Diego Garcia, "This base is not just any old base. Once you've been briefed, even partially, on what it does, the information gives you vertigo. Both now and in government, communicating the details to the public will be violating the Official Secrets Act." Can you elaborate?
Do you want to break it here?
Thank you.
Well,
you know, it's very good to be kind of up here in the space station discussing the Chagos Islands.
We can see them from here.
As you see, we're floating above the Indian Ocean. We can see the strategic position of those merry isles down below. So just to sort of begin with a bit of history, I think it's important to kind of ground us in this, which is the United States in the 1960s was looking to build what I can only describe, and I can't really describe any more to you, as certain supercapacities, which only a true hyperpower like the United States or China could really invest in, or the Soviet Union could really invest in and build. It's not something that Britain could have built on its own, and as the United States was working out where to place them, it identified these islands, which the United Kingdom was in the process of decolonising. These remote islands, none of them actually have groundwater, they only have rainwater, were being administered from Mauritius, as they had been for the entire time that they had existed as European colonies. The Americans kind of contacted the great offices of British state and went, look, we want to build these supercapacities. We want to build them there. As we can see from our little space station sort of portal there, they're in the middle of nowhere, but they're halfway to everywhere. They've got a commanding position towards India and, in particular, China, and they're sort of very close to the equator. The Americans went to the British. Look, you stay. Actually, we want you to stay. Everywhere else, we want you to leave. But here, we'd like you to stay. So you just sort it out with the Mauritians, and then we'll allow you to notionally have a sort of flag over this territory. But in reality, it's going to be an American base. And these capacities which we're going to build, look, we'll just let you have some of it. You'll never be able to build them on your own otherwise. You'll never be able to have access to it otherwise. So this is really a very good deal for you. Britain then went away, and the Foreign Office went to Mauritius. We will make an agreement with you that as long as these territories are needed for defensive purposes, they will be a British overseas territory. When they are no longer needed for defensive purposes, they will revert to Mauritius. Money was exchanged and a deal was done. Fast forward to our own times, in a completely different world, when the United Nations works completely differently and the politics are completely different. The legal position around that had begun to collapse in the United Nations through lawfare, through campaigning, and Mauritius was on the verge of successfully getting some binding rulings, which would have judged Britain's presence in that territory and illegal occupation in the eyes of those following international law. And to the Americans, this now creates a problem. What had been their solution to a problem in that world, having the colonial power state, now presented a challenge to them. So the United States began putting a very heavy pressure campaign, not just on the Labour government, but also on the previous sort of iterations, is that how I shall put it, of the Conservative government, saying, look, we actually would like you to do a deal with Mauritius. Britain's embassy in Washington, it's not just an embassy, it's almost like a Whitehall department in Washington. It's so vast. It views itself as a sort of co-creator in the policy process, much to sort of the disappointment often of teams in King Charles Street, the Foreign Office's headquarters. They started to become worried that the Americans were actually planning to do a deal with Mauritius, cut Britain out, hand over an overseas territory of the Crown to another country, and then we would lose access to these supercapacities. So that is how text-based negotiations were initiated when David Cameron was Foreign Secretary with Mauritius, with the eyes of doing a deal where everything would change in order everything to stay the same. So legally and technically and in an atlas, and if you're concerned with such matters as the privileges of issuing stamps, the islands would become under the control of...
You appreciate the irony of saying that to us.
would fall under the control of Mauritius, but in terms of any matter related to national security, the base would remain under complete Anglo-American control. And that's where I entered the Foreign Office and found that this is what the British deep state was in deep unison pushing for very aggressively, as the Americans were pushing us.
I think the real question, I think this is a sort of familiar story, and I think your point in the article you wrote in the Times about the ability to do sophisticated realpolitik and geopolitical work is a good one. The public is more reactive on these kind of things. I think the thing that people really want to understand is that binding judgment that everyone keeps bringing up. On what grounds could that have been enforced? That's, I think, the thing that people really don't understand.
So that is actually not a major concern to the British deep state in and of itself. So let me kind of explain what they were really worried about. So you've got to think of it as more of a Chagos conundrum, in which the number one thing the UK is trying to preserve access to are these supercapacities. And we found ourselves in a situation where the Biden administration were looking at that map. And down there, if we just peer out of the space station, we can see there's not just one island called Diego Garcia. Actually, there are 1,000 atolls stretched in a vast amount of terrain. And the Americans are looking at this and going, these supercapacities currently have a legal defense, they have a sort of diplomatic defense, and they have a military defense in an age when American military hardware is sort of active and busy and sort of deployed all over the world. If the legal defense collapses, that will mean that Mauritius has, there's no deal between the UK and Mauritius has walked away from the West. Mauritius is a swing state, wants to be with the West, rather be with the West than with China, but if there's no deal, they'll probably walk away to China, and then they can start inviting the Chinese. They'll be on the open market, and they'll say, we're just trying to recover our lost atolls. And at first, it might begin with a Chinese fishing fleet, then a research station, and then the whole safety of these supercapacities is compromised. Now, that safety has always been the number one priority for the United States. That's why, really exceptionally, and I hope that readers can kind of appreciate the gravity of what happens there, the United States ask for the entire native population to be removed by the UK as a precondition of the base being established. That's, of course, the tragedy of the Chagosians. Many of whom are in the UK, a lot of whom are in Mauritius. So the Democrats looked at this and went, no, we don't want the legal position we don't want the Brits to let the legal position collapse and then open up a situation where the Chinese could start playing games, because we don't want to deploy resources there, and we don't want to defend it, and we don't want to be in a situation where any aspect of the base's security is compromised. So that's why you have people like Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell telling me the only way that Britain can hurt us is by not doing is by not doing this deal. So British deep state looked at this problem, and it's not a stupid bunch of people in that world, and realised it is possible that the Democrats go and that Trump comes in. And then that Trump takes no interest in the matter, and perhaps the Chinese sort of stay away for now. But they already knew that if that was going to be the circumstances, the Americans would stop investing in these supercapacities to the same degree that they do now. And then they opened up a danger that those supercapacities would start to be moved to Hawaii. You can do very similar things in Hawaii than you can there. So that would risk the UK, even if it, played a long game and was somehow sort of persevering and outlasting, losing access to the most important thing. And that thing is so important for our security every single day in ways that I unfortunately can't stress and can't explain under the Official Secrets Act that made this the kind of policy from hell to communicate to the public.
Yeah, reading your piece, I was struck by, as you say, the difficulty of defending these atolls. 1,000 of them, you wouldn't have a kind of man with a gun on every single one of them. But I do wonder, what would the US have done if this were this territory and they were subject to the same warfare? Presumably they would have said, just fuck off Mauritius.
So, couple of things to think about there. One is that we're not the US. Like, we don't have that.
As in, we don't have the capacity to defend.
If this was the British Army of 70 or 80 years ago, you could conceivably have gone to the Americans, don't worry, we'll have a British frogman on every single base, and there will be destroyers protecting the atolls, just because the legal defence has collapsed, and with it the diplomatic defence, as Mauritius swings behind China, we've got it. You notice what's happening in Cyprus? We've got a lot of problems a lot closer to home. We do not have those resources, and we're all going to use a Yiddish word, we're all going to start kvetching and complaining about that, but that's just the world in which we live. So we are forced to ask the Americans to defend it for us. Now, the Democrats absolutely didn't want to do that, and that's why they said, no. You're not redeploying US forces that we need elsewhere. And the United States is very overstretched in the global contest against China and, its engagements in the Middle East and elsewhere, and Ukraine. We just want you to do a deal. And we know that you're perfectly capable of doing a deal where everything stays the same in terms of what the base needs, just you have to take the flag down and the Mauritians, get to colour it in an atlas as part of Mauritius. So that was where we found ourselves with the Democrats. Now, if you look at the situation with Trump, what logic are you in? The logic you're in, if you are primarily concerned about British national security, I will admit that some people seem to be primarily concerned about British national pride or British national emotion or other things. But if you are primarily concerned about access to those supercapacities, which once you know what they are, you just have to be, you need access to them, not just today. You need access to them for a century. You need access to them for as long as...
I would say 99 years is not forever.
Well, it's renewable. It's renewable for I can't remember how long. 40 years on the other end of it. No, it's not forever. We can come back to the deal. So you enter into this logic of we need to have access to this for as long as possible. Therefore, what's going to happen when Trump is gone? It's not looking too great for the midterms. Oil price today, absolutely spiking. Democrats come back and then they go, hey, remember that Chagos deal? Want it done by Tuesday. Then what's happening? And then the issue is that these capacities stop being invested in. So let's just now imagine another future. One where somehow Trump rules forever or MAGA Republicans rule forever. And the Republicans... increasingly view themselves as leaders of a global right, and it's become a global right issue. Okay, British sovereignty there sort of matters to the global right. We know for a fact that the capacities are going to start to be moved. They're just not going to be invested in. So the asset is dwindling with very bad consequences for our national security.
Because we don't get access to it if it's not on this base.
We don't get access to it. Or if we wanted access to it, it would be a completely different conversation, which we would not be able to afford. And it's not, we will not most likely not have access to it,
Sure.
is the problem. And the Americans aren't delighted that we have access to it anyway. It's a legacy. It's a
Right,
legacy.
so it's
of
written
history.
into some secret treaty that this is part of our security
Yes.
because they're using our
Yes,
our
and it
property.
dates from a unique moment in time where that kind of thing was available to us. It's not available to us now. You could try, but I think it's extremely unlikely you would get those terms or such favourable terms, and we get so much more out of it than we put into it. Now, let's just imagine don't care about the national security, and we find ourselves in a situation purely viewing these islands as a national pride project or a national emotion project. Let's just assume the Republicans rule forever, which I think is extremely unlikely, but let's just assume they do. So what we are then doing is converting these islands into an east of Suez colony for displaced Chagosians under the British flag, which has huge costs attached. And once you start to put people there in large numbers, the asset has to go, because that's the nature of the asset. So that is, that's a project. It's not a project which is coterminous with doing everything you can to protect the UK's national security at a highly volatile, highly dangerous moment in which we need access to that. So that's why the Labour government decided politics of this are very painful. It's almost impossible to explain to the public, because you can't say, look, we're worried the Democrats might even just throw us out of our own overseas territory and do a deal with the Mauritians. Look, we're worried about the Chinese penetrating. It. Look, it would be extremely bad for our everyday national security if we didn't have access. If we didn't have access to this. So the best answer is this deal with Mauritius. So that's why the Prime Minister decided that actually the most important thing was national security and not the politics of it.
I suppose what's interesting about this at the moment is there is a real sense of distrust that people externally have about the actions of those internally, which means that you can come and say this to us, and I suppose, the inevitable questions are, connections with Philip Sands, it's the
I'll be honest with you, Philip
decolonisation.
Sands was viewed as, unprintable words as how that man was described by a lot of senior officials in the Foreign Office. This is not anything to do with that.
Yeah.
That is a sort of conspiracy theory.
No, it's certainly worth noting that the Chagos
deal
deal predates the Labour government, even though Sands...
Absolutely.
There's always that famous picture of Starmer holding that ship as a guest of the Mauritians a few years ago. But this deal was underway before he came into government.
David Cameron started text-based negotiations with the Mauritians. He looked at every single possible way to try and find a way out. He walked through all of the national security implications, realised the importance of this asset, and decided that he had to continue.
Are you saying that even if we totally had it up to here with international law, we didn't care about upholding it anymore and setting an example, if we were that version of Britain, would we still be looking at something like this deal?
So, just going to move on a little bit from just sort of taking you into the bowels of King Charles Street and sort of walking you through these sort of horrifying policy planning conversations that I had when I first came in. The sort of experience that I had over this turned me from a sort of progressive Atlanticist into something closer to a sort of Anglo or Britanno-Gaullist, because it's an incredibly painful story of dependence, and our Chagos problem is really part of our America problem. So you're getting bullied into a deal by one part of the American system. You can't rely on the other part of the American system to rule indefinitely, because that would obviously be absurd. The other part of the American system then, because it understands the logic of needing an absolutely secure perimeter, initially wants a deal, then doesn't want a deal, then wants a deal, and it keeps on coming back because the American military and the CIA want it for very good reasons, ends up being used as a tool not of foreign policy but as foreign politics by the American right to sort of humiliate the Prime Minister. It's a really sorry story. But the problem is our relationship with America and everything that that sort of says.
It's an interesting. I mean, but at the same time, you're saying these hypercapacities are so important that almost anything has to be done to preserve them, right?
Yes, that's correct. But it's absolutely not a great situation to be in. But it's just the real problem is not international law. The real problem is what do the Americans want to do with us and with it.
Yeah.
That is the issue, and that is basically impossible for a sitting government to communicate.
Isn't there a world
Again,
where
because of weakness?
Surely there is some sum of money with which we could have just told Mauritius to fuck off. Like, here's £1 billion, relinquish your claim.
Well, no, because they know what this asset is, and like they know what this asset is. They know the importance of Ireland. And to be honest,
So that's why it was such a crazy amount of money, because they have our national security over a barrel.
So coming back to if we want to look at the money. So why the money? First reason is the Mauritians get to call themselves sovereign over the island.
Yeah.
I was actually surprised that they agreed to the terms of the deal, because they get to call themselves sovereign, and that's basically it in terms of what happens around.
But we have to notify them when we use it.
That you have to, look at all of these American bases around the world. Those sort of diplomatic niceties. What
about this kind of African treaty against nuclear weapons?
It's absolutely not an issue for the national security concerns of the base. Absolutely not an issue. The UK would be paying rent entirely at market rates, the same as the French in Djibouti or elsewhere. The money is also a nice way to tie the Mauritians, because it becomes an enormous part of their budget, into a sort of global West indefinitely. So that's where so for 0.2% of the UK's annual defence budget, that's where the kind of logic of the money comes.
I suppose there's no recourse in the treaty for actually turning off the taps, though, right? We've just signed up to give them this money every year for 99 years. There's no mechanism by which to try and withhold it.
The assumptions baked into the treaty is that both parties are following it. If we wanted to have a conversation about like break clauses and different ways that different manners in which the UK could withhold payments and so forth, we can look into those legal details. But the most important thing to remember is that if one found oneself literally in a sort of state of war with Mauritius, then the treaty would have been broken, and all the other ways you can defend the island would of course kick in. What you're trying to do is keep a legal perimeter and a diplomatic perimeter and a military perimeter. If for some reason they decided that they didn't want to follow the treaty, the military perimeter would of course remain.
I suppose you
can't say that again when you're in government, but that is obviously true.
But what about, I think the example you gave at the beginning, right, where you said an amount of money, £3 million was handed over to the Mauritians, that they accepted that the Chagos Islands would be separated from Mauritius. It seems that is a good precedent or example where things that were once thought to be legally settled can become reopened when it's politically expedient.
Well, that's the kind of final point, I guess, on the I want to make about the Chagos deals. The Chagos deal. Just to be really clear, you can get into all these hypotheticals. What if they didn't follow it? What if they did that on the other? Well, then you just defend the base. The military perimeter is still there. And Mauritius may not want to hear that in public, and you can't say that as a government official, and that is the unspoken and obvious truth of the matter. Looking forward, in terms of our position in the rest of the century, I was so horrified that we had found ourselves in this situation. And how do we find ourselves in this situation? We found ourselves in this situation because a critical dependence on the Americans changing, becoming unpredictable, extremely unpredictable and extremely erratic over this, and because we hadn't anticipated future lawfare, and we found ourselves in a situation where, with the changing nature of the world, Western powers and Western European powers sort of not what they were, things that, as you just said, were seen as having been settled in the United Nations and in these sort of high courts of international law can now be easily overturned. It's sort of worth sort of noting a little bit just how much those forums have changed as power has redistributed. The United Nations of the late 40s and the early 50s is a place that sort of barely mentioned what France was doing in Algeria. This was so dominated by the Western powers. And all of those graphs of our shrinking economic share, those are matched by our shrinking political share and influence in those bodies. So you need to just assume that on current trends, our power's not going to be growing. Anyway, the rate needed to get back to a world where people don't challenge us at all, or we're seen as absolutely dominant. So what is our strategy for all of our other overseas territories? And that's something that I was sort of working on, because I don't want something like what happened to those atolls and happened to Labour in office to ever happen to another British government again.
There's a funny map on the UN website, which is a map of what some committee deems colonies, and I'm pleased to report to listeners that Britain apparently has more colonies than anyone else put together. But if you look a bit closely at the way this map is designed, France hardly has any overseas territories on it, and that's because they've made them overseas départements. So it's just a trick of the accounting, which I think you've talked about before.
Exactly. Well, sort of. I spent a lot of time in the Foreign Office trying to prepare my thinking and to prepare a plan and start to do the beginnings of a plan to basically look ahead how to defend all of our other overseas territories. And the reality is that, as you just said, we have all these territories around the world. Almost all of them are in some kind of crisis, have some kind of vulnerability, have some kind of problem, and they are all on a list at the United Nations which says they are colonies, which means that they are vulnerable to an unpredictable future where lawfare we know is used against the United Kingdom. The French have taken historically a completely different approach. They took an approach where those remaining territories that wanted to stay with France were incorporated directly into France as overseas départements, and they have seats in the National Assembly. They are treated exactly the same as metropolitan France, which is why technically there's a piece of South America known as French Ghana, which is part of the European Union. So my strong belief is that we need to take an approach like that, not exactly the same, it'd be different for Britain. We've got a different kind of constitution and different kinds of issues, different kinds of issues, different kind of problems. We can do things that they can't. Where those overseas territories become, in my dream, they would become overseas kingdoms of the United Kingdom. Progressive. They would have their right of self-determination. Only if they wanted to could they would they enter into this relationship. And we would make strenuous, non-stop efforts to remove them from this awful list at the United Nations that makes it look as if they are sinful colonies.
The naughty list.
Of sinful colonies of an old sinful
I like to think of it as a leaderboard, but your mileage may vary.
Exactly. We would protect them in that manner. And
can you give a few examples of these islands and the problems that they're in?
Sure. Let's go from...
Mention Antarctica for an additional 5 marks.
Oh, fine. No. So you have some of them that are incredibly successful, like Bermuda. Incredible traditions, historic springboards for, the conquest of North America. A place that just doesn't receive visits from British cabinet. Long gone are the days when Macmillan would want to host meetings of the Americans in British territories in the Caribbean. They have an independence movement. They sort of wonder what's in it for them. So there is a looming political crisis of that territory at some point in the future, sort of walking away. Who knows what kind of expansionist desires that might lurk in the American id as it looks for morsels in North America. You have places like British Virgin Islands, which have become money laundering, entrepôts, huge governance and corruption problems. The inhabitants actually sort of suffering from, very poor public services. Presence from our adversaries in various different forms, some which I'm going to, some which I can't, from Russian money laundering to Chinese influence. Some like Turks and Caicos Islands, some of those beautiful beaches on planet Earth, overrun with gangs from Haiti. So let's just spin the globe a little bit. Actually, let's look out the window of the space station.
We can go round to the other side. I'll put the foot on the accelerator of it.
Now, in the middle of the Pacific, you have Pitcairn, 50 inhabitants, thereabouts, descendants of the, ladies and gentlemen who were the crew of the famous Bounty that mutinied. They passed some demographic tipping points, only one young person left on the island. Somebody sort of came to me in the Foreign Office, in fact, the governor of the island, and went, it's probably not going to be the first problem you deal with in your time in King Charles Street, but you're going to have to make a decision. Are you depopulating the island and moving all these people away so they don't have access to anything remotely like public services before they die in a lot of sort of grisly manners? Are you repopulating the island? Are you sending people out there to build a community, but it's going to be very difficult because they don't want outsiders? Are you converting it into a park or a military installation? What are you doing with it? Now, this is an issue that interested me. I've got to say there's a lot going on in the world. It's not an issue that I was able to bring to the Foreign Secretary. It's not an issue I was able to prioritise. But if I had been Foreign Secretary, I would have prioritised it, because it's a classic example of benign neglect of an incredible asset. It's an island in the middle of the Pacific, huge maritime domain around it. We know, the untold riches of the oceans and of all of the sort of incredible things that you might be able in some future to do, and we're just sort of not
we're just squandering.
We're just squandering it. We're not doing anything. It's registered as a colony at the United Nations. We might wake up in 80 years, a sort of weaker Britain has been cornered by some incredible lawfare case, and it's got no inhabitants. And how can we prove that it sort of should stay part of the British family? And the obvious answer is to incorporate it into the United Kingdom, and to say it is part of the United Kingdom in the same manner, as the Orkneys or the Isle of Mull or some other, or the Isle of Man, probably more like the Isle of Man or Sark or Jersey. That would be a sort of way to do it. Now, we have all kinds of others. You have Tristan da Cunha, which has again an amazing commanding position in the oceans. You have St. Helena, 4,000 people. One of the most potentially crucial island in the if you seek to security in the Atlantic, and an age in which we know the Chinese Navy is literally undergoing the biggest military build-up in human history.
And also
might be a good idea.
We have about 15 vessels in the Navy.
Well, yes, that's a problem. But so my dream would be that each of them would be incorporated as overseas kingdoms. We would somehow rationalise the crown dependencies and the overseas territories. They get a sort of rebrand all as overseas kingdoms. They would have the right to self-determination as part of the United Kingdom, and then we would just sort of take care of them properly. We would have, instead of them being run out of the Foreign Office, which is ridiculous because they're not foreign, we would create a start-up department for the overseas kingdoms that would sit in the centre. So I would, I was the SPAD covering them, so I knew what a lot of their problems were. They don't have access to BBC iPlayer, they can't use certain banking cards, loads of sort of basic problems. Now, because our system of government sort of works so poorly, if it's not directly in your target zone as a department, you have to ask another department. If the other department is not interested in answering the message sent by your private secretary and not interested in answering the text sent by the SPAD, it can only be resolved by the Secretary of State. An issue like BBC iPlayer in the overseas territories is not ever going to merit going to that top level unless you had a kind of ministry at the centre empowered by an important figure in the government. And that could be it could sit under a prime minister in the cabinet office, it could sit under a deputy prime minister, but in my view it would have to be a figure, I'm not just saying deputy prime minister because my old boss is now deputy prime minister, but it's a figure of note. There has to be a minister of rank in the cabinet that the islanders would recognise as important to visit them, because they don't get visits. A foreign secretary is never going to be able to go, okay, it's St Helena time.
I thought that'd be a great opportunity. You know, what a gig to get.
But it's just not. It's just not when you've got to go to Cyprus, Middle East. It's just in a world of crisis. It's just not a priority.
Tom volunteers to put on his safari suit and go off.
Right. So, what are the prospects of this plan now that you've left government?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about where we got. So, like the bit that actually turned into a plan. You know, like I pitched the vision, and look. Foreign Secretary at the time was interested. He was intrigued and come up with some first steps. You know, come up with a couple of first steps. And you know, he's intrigued because Labour, of course, you know, 1997 had a white paper for the territories. Labour came up with a name. Obviously, like, Labour coming in was a moment of sort of renewal.
Well, didn't Jonathan Powell say when we gave away Hong Kong, like, this should be the last time? He said that to Tony Blair.
Tony Blair
said that.
Jonathan Powell, who was, of course,
maybe Jonathan Powell
chief
wouldn't have said that,
of the
but this has got to be the last time that we...
It was Tony Blair that said that. So, you know, Blair took an interest in the overseas territories. You know, in terms of why I actually got into a plan, it was I wanted to make I hated the position that the Chagos deal had put us in politically. The right was able to say that Labour has a surrender agenda. I wanted to demonstrate that that's not true, that actually there isn't some secret plot to give up every single one of these islands because we're sort of, I don't know, desperate to go to cocktail parties in Doughty Street or like Matrix Chambers, or there's some plot emanating from the wigged world of QC. Just, and for me, one of the ideas that made it into an actual paper which I was preparing for Foreign Secretary at the time was that they should, when they have what's called the Joint Ministerial Council that come to London every year, again, we could make a thing of that. Why does it have such an awful acronym? Why does nobody knows it happens? Certainly in France, they make a big deal of it. In France, the minister responsible for the overseas territories is, he is equivalent of a great office of state. You know, like they have an important person doing it with rank.
Well, like the India office, right? It would have been. It's a big job that you have to do.
Well, maybe not the exact example that I would first say.
No, but bring back the viceroys. We need a viceroy of.
Well, they don't want that. What they want is they want to be respected. They want to get more out of their relationship with Britain, and they want to be safe and they want to be secure. Currently, so many of them have got problems. So what made it into the actual plan was I wanted them to have the right to have their own members of the House of Lords. We've got, you know, bishops and you know, rabbis and donors and all kind, you know, imams and all kinds of sort of people in the House of Lords. Why not have a dozen from the overseas territories? Seemed like a great idea at the time, and that's one that I know they were interested in. You know, that would symbolise the bond. They would have their own people in the policy process. But I just don't like the fact that they're colonies. I don't like the fact that they are British nationals that don't have any representation in Westminster. In Westminster, you know, it's all mediated through people at the Foreign Office who may or may not care about them, and usually don't because they've got other priorities. I had an idea for a overseas territories sort of volunteer corps, just to get people thinking about them, dreaming about them, knowing about them. Like in France, they're on all the maps of France that publish in schools. There's sort of tiny bits of subsidies that mean that they're
Marine Le Pen goes and campaigns in Réunion, right?
Exactly. They've got members of the legislature. There's money for sort of nature documentaries there. People know about them.
It's a pain in the arse to get to the Falklands. We've actually looked this up. Like you have to go and you know, plead with the office and try and get on some kind of supply flight.
That's true. I did make it down to the Falklands. If we had survived at the Foreign Office a bit longer, I was going to go. But alas, there's no picture of me.
That's a bit of a hospital pass.
Yeah. I'm kind of interested, and I think we've, you know, I'm quite convinced by it, but I'm interested by your sort of Damascene conversion to, as you say, being an Anglo-Gaullist and thinking about how do we protect these and make them a sort of sustainable part of the future? Because how does this sense of, we don't like their colonies, we don't like this risk of lawfare, how does that kind of square with the sense on the left? And I'm not. This is not me trying to sort of like jump at you and attack the left, but I'm just genuinely interested. Like, there is a real sense of, you know, international law is this important thing. It's something that the right is kind of skeptical of. the left has made it its sort of mission that we are going to be lawful. Is that fair?
Well, I'm not saying that I don't want to be lawful.
No,
What
sure.
I'm saying is I want to be a good lawyer and like not neglect these territories. I want to, think ahead. Like any boy, like if I ever needed for my own affairs to take on somebody from Edwin Coe or Matrix Chambers, they might say you've got some legal liabilities here. You might want to protect those a bit better. So basically, I think right now on this issue and actually on quite a few other issues we can get into, there's absolutely no reason that loving the overseas territories and wanting them to be closer to the home isles and wanting a kind of new settlement that brings them up and elevates them, there's absolutely no reason that's not a left-wing cause. Why is that not a left-wing cause? Because I want them not to be colonies. I want them to have members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I hate the fact that in all our legislation, and this is centuries of legislation, they're referred to as colonies. And I did discuss, could we sort of use AI to clean up the legislation so it would refer to them as something else overseas? That's about the idea. So actually it's about democracy. It's democratic, and it's about giving them a better legal position. Like nothing about it is sort of, I don't like international law, I'm putting a crown on them. Like
But do you think there's others who, others on the left who would say the fact they're colonies, they should be released, right? That I suppose is the
they can go whenever they want. And under my vision, if they don't want to stay, don't want to be part of it, fine.
Sure.
That's I'm obviously believe in their right to self-determination. But they are part of the British family because they want to be part of the British family. And what I'm really concerned about is all these ones in particular that are so small or uninhabited or almost uninhabited, that are weak legal positions, and our weakness generally will not be able to retain them for the future as part of, a sort of Britain across multiple oceans.
I think there is a deep and very interesting question here about the left's and the right's attitudes towards sovereignty and national greatness. And I hope we can come back to that because I do think it's very interesting. But I think that when it comes to the overseas territories, it's not simply a kind of issue of legality and representation. It's also one of, to use the phrase, use it or lose it. So someone like the Falklands are sparsely populated. I've spoken to someone who works in Parliament who thinks that we should be reclaiming land around the Falklands, that we should be building a big city on it so that we have a better claim than, the small number of people who are currently there now. So to me, it seems that there's a kind of dearth of entrepreneurial zeal that we could be applying to these territories. If we make them into kind of great cities that are well populated, that are generating wealth, that to me seems to be the better guarantee of long-term security than kind of how we demarcate them.
Definitely, I agree.
Well, or a big navy.
If you build some kind of new Hong Kong and the Falklands, then you'll be better able to afford the navy. I mean, clearly we need to be able to defend these.
I like these dreams, but I think that.
Okay, well, what about Antarctica? Do you like that dream? Mining it till it's empty.
I actually think that the Antarctica Treaty is important, and one should. We shouldn't want to sort of hasten the downfall of that. If we start, my personal belief is that if we start a sort of strip mining contest with the Chinese in Antarctica, we will almost certainly lose.
Never start a strip mining contest with the Chinese. I think my grandfather told me that once.
But if that treaty would ever to break down or collapse, I would of course want us to defend our claim. But let's look at the Falklands. I completely share your desire to dream and to think about what could be done there, and I hate the way that the British state now and always has been stuck in the sort of infamous Cheam's mindset, or just bored of these, just not even thinking about these places. Just looking back into history, there are so many opportunities that were lost because of treasury mindset. One of them being the island of Malta. Malta at one moment that was lost wanted to become a overseas kingdom or a kingdom of the United Kingdom, and it was a treasury mindset of how much it's going to cost. What about their pensions that lost lost that chance for for the British people to have a sort of Mediterranean edge to them, and there is no reason to think just because there's always been very small population in the Falklands, there should always be in the future a very small population in the Falklands. No reason. If it was islands that belong to the Chinese, or if they were islands that belong to the Americans, they would have dreams for them. And what are our dreams for them? What are our visions? Where's our entrepreneurial zeal in a world in which Trump is fantasizing about Greenland? Where's ours for the Falklands or for St Helena? The answer is it's not to be found in Whitehall, but hopefully it's to be found on sort of inspiring podcasts like this.
But it's an interesting. But again, do you not think though that part of the reason that we have this problem is there's a sort of hard split where if you're at all on the left, it's colony bad, don't even talk about it, ignore it. If you're on the right, it's all the national pride, so you have to defend it, whatever, and fly the flag and be bombastic. That means that it's really eroded that sort of ability in the middle to have these kind of conversations.
I think so.
That's slightly self-congratulatory.
Like the West is evil or based hyperborea.
Yeah, well, that's just bad, and I just think that's just bad and stupid, and I just completely reject that. But it's, they're not colonies. They want to be part of the UK. What I'm talking about is a way to, get rid of those sort of vestigial aspects in which they are colonies, including a very important one if they don't have members of the legislature, and then coming up together with them. I'm not saying that we should phone them up and be like, hey, we're building a huge, free economic zone on your heads against your will. No, we obviously don't want to do that. It would have to be done in partnership with them.
I mean, my sense is that every national community that is healthy probably should have enough self-belief to want not only to hold on to what it's got, but perhaps even to expand. And I don't mean that in a kind of invasive way or jingoistic way, but if you believe that your way of life works, then maybe you should be thinking, oh, we could go back to Malta one day. We could be setting an example and like signing up other countries to be overseas kingdoms. To me, it seems a sign of kind of poor national psychological health.
It's not, our way of life is not working for these overseas territories.
Yeah,
in which, if you're in the British Virgin Islands, you've got a super corrupt government with real governance issues that people that just don't have public services like we do here. They're British nationals and they don't have the kinds of goods we have. You go to the Turks and Caicos Islands, there are gangs all over the street. You go to St Helena, life is pretty rough and tough there. You've got 50 British nationals out on an island in the Pacific without any vision whatsoever for their future. The fact, you've answered the question. The fact that there is no sort of vision for these places betrays a lack of confidence in our own way of life.
But this is, I think, a weakness of our own here in Britain, right? We don't believe in ourselves enough to want to give a better offering to these overseas territories. We don't believe in ourselves enough to give an offering to America is trying to woo Greenland. Right now, we're not doing anything like that. Even if we had the might to do it, we wouldn't have the kind of spiritual backbone.
Yes, I think that's a problem. As we're at a moment in our political history in which our confidence is.
I don't think people kind of understand the profundity of the profundity of how kind of badly spiritually broken we've become as a country. I don't know what has to happen for the left and the centre to.
I mean, I would also include the right in many cases in that there is this looks maybe a little bad to listeners that Ben has come on and now I'm immediately coming around and converted to his point of view. But a point of like
it's well made.
Yeah. No, but a point of view that you have to. That there is an unhelpful jingoism that can be unhelpful when you're trying to achieve something complicated. Again, this line that you put in your piece about the difficulty of doing complicated geopolitical negotiations and discussions, that if the public doesn't trust that the government is acting in its interests, it will make a stink about things, even if there is information that is hidden, and thus it should be allowed to go ahead.
It's a huge problem. Just to come back to the kind of Chagos problem is, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, you had a generation of politicians. They'd fought in the war side by side. It happened all the time. The foreign secretary would take the shadow foreign secretary, so it's almost always a conservative politician taking in a loyal Labour man from the opposition, gives them the intelligence briefing, goes, look, looks crazy, but actually this is why we've got to do it, and actually this is the position, and actually this is what we... So many things were shepherded through by that quiet, common, sort of common sense sort of patriotism and trusts on either side. And it was a society where you had a lot more gatekeepers. You could phone up as the foreign secretary, the editor of the Times, and be like, or Telegraph, and go, look. I know it looks weird, but don't go big on this. And that's why, against so many expectations, even at the time, the Union flag went down in so many places around the world, and decolonisation, whilst preserving a lot of British power and a lot more than the French managed, to be honest, at the time, was such a success. We just don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world, of social media, hyperpolarised politics, where, in my opinion, the beat of politics is like the beat of the internet. You have one political movement after the other going viral and then collapsing without much behind it in terms of intellectual, sort of...
Well, I mean, some internet movements have a bit more life to them, but...
you have politics that tends to be a lot more sort of fandom than before.
Yeah.
And, it's a real problem for democracies to manage.
Well, I think there's a gap not merely between a partisan gap between the ruling party and kind of the next biggest party. There's also a gap between the government and the governed in a way that there hasn't been, in a way that I think is quite singular to the modern era. And I'm thinking of issues like immigration, where government policy has been to kind of throw millions of unfamiliar people at us every single year. And no wonder the public is furious with things like asylum hotels. No wonder the public can't trust the government.
Well, let's talk about asylum hotels, actually. It's kind of interesting. That's quite an interesting question, which is about government sort of being honest with the public. So when we were part of the European Union, our main source of cheap and low-skilled labour, and we need cheap and low-skilled labour, were, surprise, surprise, Europeans. They legally can't claim asylum. They never bring their families, they don't want to. Often go home. If they marry local. When we left the European Union, we replaced European cheap and low-skilled labour and students with people from the global south. You're bringing people now from countries that have a terrible human rights record. So people always want to claim asylum when they get here. They're much poorer, so people are desperate to bring their families over, often of different religious backgrounds, so tend to marry within the group. So fundamentally, it's a different kind of immigration that you're getting that requires a completely different asylum system. So when your cheap and low-skilled labour is coming from the European Union, you can have a not very expensive, not very visible, light touch asylum system. You don't have to build a hyper asylum deportation repatriation machine. You just don't need it. If you don't want that labour, you want this labour, then you've got to. It's not, in my view, it's, I was frequently asked by Number 10, like, can't the Foreign Office do more to bully this country or that country to sort of do more overseas, in organised immigration crime enforcement? And I'd say, look, yeah, we can and we are, but, if I was from that country, of course I'd claim asylum when I got to the UK. As a student, surely as a listener who's thinking, gosh, this was the type of person who was in the government. That's not a very reassuring thing to hear. When I understand that you can sympathise. The point is that the Conservative Party and Reform are not being honest with the public about why the asylum spike is happening. The asylum spike is happening because they pushed a politics that shifted the kind of low-skilled and the sort of low-skilled labour we have, that is the Boris wave. So as long as you do not take advantage of European labour, you want that global labour, you're always going to have more asylum claims. So you're always going to have a much bigger and more expensive asylum system. I'm not. It's a completely value-free judgment about the people. The people are the same. Good people from Global South, good people from Eastern Europe. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just one group of people because they're coming from poorer countries that are a mess are going to want to claim asylum, and people coming from countries that are much similar to us in terms of economic setup and legally cannot claim asylum are just not. So I do not believe, and I'm sure you'd accept, that the public is not being told the truth about this by right-wing parties. And until the right finds its way through that, I think there's going to be a lot of anger and frustration because people just don't understand why this is happening.
No, I don't think it's the case that if you import some cheap labour, then you have to have the asylum and immigration system that we do. I mean, there are plenty of different immigration systems across the world where there's much less of an incentive for people to come here, and there's fewer pathways for people to bring their families, where there's more kind of native cultural assertiveness that prevents integration problems of the kind that are rampant these days.
So there's a couple of parts to that. And I wasn't a home office spat, so I can't give you the full details.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to.
I wasn't a home office spat. I'm happy to talk about it. Shabana Mahmood's done a vast amount to correct that and to bring us in line and to end asylum shopping. She's done that. A lot more to be done, a lot more you can do. What I'm really talking about is the scale and cost of the asylum system. Like, if you are primarily servicing your economy with cheap labour that you need from Europe, you don't have to spend so much on an asylum system. It's not going to be so visible. If you want to service it with people from the rest of the world, and you might want to do that, you've got every reason to do that. There are a lot of good people from the rest of the world, a lot of good talent from the rest of the world. It's got nothing to do with that. You're just going to have to build a bigger, a much more expensive, and much more visible system, which is how we ended up with hotels. And how we ended up with hotels in the first place, because people from countries with terrible human rights records claim asylum.
It's probably a good point, actually, in that because we didn't record immigration from European countries, it doesn't appear, so the spike looks a lot more noticeable. So in comparison, it's not a spike, probably it's actually in somewhat just a replacement.
So if the right was genuinely, this is me pushing the challenge back at you if you don't mind. If the right was genuinely committed to, reducing the asylum problem, it would be actively pushing for us to switch back to European labour.
Well, no, I think I would say my argument would be that building
against the policies they brought in with Brexit.
building any kind of country on the sort of pyramid scheme of cheap labour is fundamentally a bad idea. That instead it keeps productivity low and it occupies housing, prevents people having families, prevents birth rates, and it delays automation and things like that. That is our argument. I think the assumption that you have to.
What Calum's trying to say is we don't want any of them.
Well, I'm in favour of immigration. I'm happy to say, I'm proud to say that. I think that there's a sustainable level of immigration of around a couple of 100,000 a year, which is highly beneficial to the UK. I think the levels.
A couple of 100,000 a year is, if you take a population of 60 million, that doesn't take a huge amount of time before you are meaningfully, permanently altering the country. I do think it's fair enough to be for it, but we have to also be honest about the realities of that process. People were complaining. Admittedly, EU figures don't get counted, but 200,000.
Well, they do. EU immigration figures were counted in the migration figures. If that.
Okay, I think what I'm saying is you don't see when they go home. So it's a lot.
No, you do.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, no, I'm wrong there. I'm wrong there. Fair enough.
Look, I think that there is a couple of 100,000 a year, maybe on the lower end of that. There is a sustainable level of migration, to this country, and I think it's beneficial to this country. I agree that we need to have a system that's not so heavily based on low skilled labour. We have that system now, and it will take a long time to move away from that. if the right was genuinely committed in wanting and honest, in my view, about wanting less asylum claims at all costs, it will be pushing for us to go back to the system that we had before Brexit, where most of that labour was coming from Europe, from which the people cannot legally claim asylum, and less from countries like Pakistan or Nigeria, or where, of course, they want to claim asylum because those countries have problems.
Ben, I want to come back to something from earlier, which is to do with the attitude of the left towards national expansion, national greatness, this kind of thing. Calum and I have been dying for a good left-wing view of what Anglo-futurism with redistributive characteristics or something like that would be. And the silence is deafening. It seems only to be people on the right who care about the kind of long-term future of the country and national greatness. So, I mean, to the extent that you agree with that, I'd like to know what you think needs to change.
I do think that there has been I do think that there needs to be sort of more dreaming again on the centre-left, that there needs to be a kind of rediscovery of futurism. And I do think there needs to be a progressive futurism to sort of answer your call. This brings me back to something I sort of mentioned earlier, which by my sort of growing fascination of de Gaulle in government. Like de Gaulle, comes to power when France was really at a low ebb. Fourth Republic, you have, I believe it's 19 governments in 10 years. You have the quagmire of Algeria. It makes our current travails look slight by comparison. And he threw the country into a kind of futurism, into a kind of quest for a French modernity. It was a vision of nuclear power, of high-speed trains, of motorways. It was politics as a sort of national morale boost that covered some incredibly painful tactical retreats in French Algeria. Indochina had only just been sort of wrapped up a couple of years before. And I think that there's something in that for the left and right to discover and rediscover in England today.
But is that
Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, all the overseas territories?
But de Gaulle is an interesting example because his major opponents, right? So when he re-announced that he was going to stand, and a lot of the deputies that joined his new party, whose name I now can't remember, left the MRP, which was the kind of right-wing party, and his major opponents were the sort of the socialists and the communists. And maybe this is us sort of really trying to bait you like with like a sort of
don't mind.
a bear trying to get.
I went after Brexit, so you
getting a reaction out of you. But
do you guys support Brexit? Are you sort of committed Brexiteers, or are we sort of tiring of that?
No. I was actually a Remainer at the time.
Yeah, me too.
And now I would vote Leave today.
You would vote Leave.
I would vote Leave.
Me too.
That's interesting.
So yeah, to de Gaulle, and my question to you is the difficulty with, and again, this is me sort of tail wagging the dog of a question or leading question, that because the left has got much of what it wants, it now struggles because it has to defend a lot of the status quo, and it's uncomfortable with the idea of like big ambitious actions because a lot of them feel right-wing, or they feel like change would be a betrayal of the process that led us to these positions. I think it's an interesting point on like international law, and the threat of lawfare was a lot of this. It was a sort of internationalist post-World War. We were going to fix all of international relations this way, and now it's come back to bite us.
Sure, I agree with. A lot of that analysis. I find that there's a sort of problem of diagnosis and a sort of generational gap on the sort of centre left. You have a generation of politicians whose intellectual formation is resistance to Thatcherism. They viewed the British state as being a bit too authoritarian. And maybe it was, to an extent at the time. The main left-wing intellectual project, if we really drill into it, is Charter 88. It's the New Statesman launching a plan for a constitution. The right today, is sort of pointing fingers at Blair's destruction of the constitution and has a critique of the constitution of its own. Really what it's complaining about is the successful project of Charter 88 that achieved, from Freedom of Information Act to devolution, it achieved almost everything it wanted, apart from, proportional representation and an actual federal constitution for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I don't share that view that the state is overmighty and authoritarian. The state that I see is paralysed, it's weak, it's slow, it's sclerotic, it's not able to use its power. There's too much power concentrated in, what is in so many ways like the most centralised state in the developed world in Whitehall, but Downing Street is too weak to sort of marshal it. I just don't see that. I think that's a gap between sort of the older generation and the younger generation that sort of that sort of understand that. I think the left has been poor and weak and a bit slow to understand, the sort of new world that's sort of breaking out technologically and the full consequences of that, and has allowed talking about AI to be a sort of right-coded thing, talking about biotech to be a right-coded thing, talking about hydrogen to be a right-coded thing, talking about fusion to be a right-coded thing. That is fucking stupid. And there needs to be a sort of progressive futurism that's all about grabbing these resources of the 21st century and these incredible technologies of tomorrow and like deploying them in a progressive way. And this comes back to what I view as sort of the main problem of, what Labour has faced in government, which is when Labour, actually let's say this a different way, when Thatcher came to power in the 80s.
The old instincts kicking in.
Exactly. When Thatcher came to power, you'll like this, it's very respectful of her. When Thatcher came to power in the 1980s, the sort of old-time mandarins told me that at first, the way civil service works is I want to do something, can I have some advice? Civil service produces the advice, the minister goes, yes, no, sends it back. She would go, I want to do something, they'd send up some advice. They would go, Prime Minister, here is the social democratic option that we did before, here is the mixed economy option, and here is the neoliberal option. After 18 years, they only sent up the neoliberal option. That is mastering the state, got a clear intellectual project on what he wants to do. Tony Blair achieved exactly the same thing with the third way. Labour doesn't quite have that. So you have different departments, different ministers choosing different options, from an old Labour answer to a mixed economy answer to a futurist answer. You don't have a single answer that gets all the worker bees in the civil service working towards the Queen, all the ants working in a single direction. And my personal view is that that direction should be a sort of progressive futurism that's all about always trying to choose the most high-tech, the most innovative answer, but deploying it, for better outcomes for British people, deploying it in a progressive way.
Can I ask, before we wrap up, about your view on the rise of the sort of degrowthers and the low energy, or sort of anti-energy, anti-growth thread of the left and the sort of environmentalists? Is that a reaction to the right taking or making nuclear power and things right-coded? Is that just genuinely the sort of where the energy on the left is? Because that is clearly, that's shaping up to be the big argument, right? It's AI consumes all this water, that's evil, that's bad. Anyone who uses AI is thus immoral.
I think that the degrowth movement is absolutely idiotic, and I think needs to be mercilessly called out and mocked. And I think it's really a sort of an iteration or a pop-up of a sort of Luddite moralism that I don't think understands any of the the real futurism that has been the sort of greatness of the Labour Party and the greatness of social democracy in Europe since the war. So if you are centre-left and you're listening to this and you've got a friend who's a degrowther, please pitilessly make fun of them for their erroneous ways.
Well, listeners, you heard the man. Mock the degrowthers. Come up with a theory of progressive Anglo-futurism. Ben, we've got to drop you off so you can pick up a child.
That's right.
It's been a pleasure having you. I don't think we agree on everything, but it's been a very enlightening discussion.
We don't have to.
I hope. So thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been great.
Listeners, you should read Ben's piece in the Times about the Chagos deal and the other discussions. And Ben, where can people read more about your ideas about the overseas territories and overseas kingdoms?
There was an article about me in, I think it was the Bermuda Gazette, which talked about these ideas and how they were causing conversation on the island, as so they should.
And you're the author of This is Europe and This is Britain as well. So Ben Judas stands, you know what to do.
Thank you.
All the ones rushing to listen to this podcast. I'm sure you've got your book already. Right. It's
7 minutes to 5.
7 minutes to 5, shit.
Right. Okay. No, right. In that case, we will go off and sign off. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you, listeners.